Hi, welcome back to the Busy Corner. This is lesson 27, and today I'm going to show you how to make a slip stitch throw. This is made with Bernat yarn, the blanket yarn. You will need 5 balls of the 10.5 ounces, and this is done in the variegated silver steel, I believe the color is, and it was a free pattern hanging on those displays at Joann Fabrics, and they called for a US 15 circular needle, 36 inches long. That's a 10 millimeter. And so I'm making it on the 36 inch, 3/8 inch polyethylene tubing that I showed you the last time. Now, you notice that I altered the hoop shape a little bit. It looks more like a light bulb now. I turned the tips up a bit because I found, as I gripped it between my knees, that it was easier to do, make the stitches, than when they were facing each other. And you see now that it's out, has some weight to it, and I can kind of hold it down there. I'm not really gripping it between my knees. I'm just sitting it there. And the right side of this is facing me, if you will. It's facing this way. It usually faces the other way, but this is the wrong side of the pattern. It's the right side of the piece, but it's on the pattern it's considered the wrong side. But for us, that puts it forward, and that's better because you want to see these stitches as you're making them. I think it's easier to form them this way. So this is 115 stitches on here. You can see it wouldn't have to be quite 36 inches of tubing, but they say that because you'd be knitting that with your tips. So they mean a tip-to-tip measurement, just a FYI. And this is going to take 5 balls. I think I already said that. So to get us started, all I've done is put 11 stitches on a smaller piece of tubing, and it wanted us to do 5 rows of garter stitch. So I began on the right, as always, and I did 5 rows. Now I'm over here. Now the pattern, after our 5 rows of garter stitch, it says, noting that first row is your wrong side. If a pattern doesn't say anything about what side or the other, you can assume that they mean you're starting on the right side. But for this pattern, you're not. But let's just do it exactly. I did exactly how the pattern was written, except that I still reversed the stitches on this left side. But because of that, because the first row is your wrong side, then the right side of this thing is going to be facing us, and that's a good thing, if you understand what I mean. So if you have some of the sticky mat, it'll help you in the beginning stages of your knitting here. And I think we'll need Joe to move the camera back behind now to start. So we're going to move the camera up, and if you put the sticky mat between your knees, we'll have to come up with some special knitting pants, like riding breeches, but they'll have like sticky mat on the inside of your knees, and you can knit anywhere. But anyway, and that'll help you kind of angle it a little bit. So now, as I said, I've done the 5 rows of garter stitch, and now I'm ready to begin the first row of the pattern. And you want to make sure that your yarn is in the right place. So get your tail out of the way. And the first direction for the first row is right side, it says. So you notice our right side now is here, not here like usual. Knit 3, slip 1 purlwise. So it's a pattern repeat of 4 stitches. Now we reverse the stitches just like always on this left hand side. So I'm not going to knit my stitches, I'm going to back stitch them or purl them for 3 stitches. So take your stitch off. You can do your snugging now if you want to for that first stitch. It's a little easier. And this is your second back stitch. This is your third back stitch. And now you're going to slip 1 purlwise with the yarn, and they just mean to have your yarn in the front as if you were purling, and you're going to take the stitch off and you're going to put it on exactly as it came off. So don't twist the stitch. If assuming the pipe is coming in the back of the stitch this way, you're going to put it on the same way. The stitch has to face the same direction. Otherwise, you're going to twist it. Now you're going to knit, well, back stitch 3. So you're going to purl, in other words, or back stitch. And again, you're going to slip as if to purl, which means having your yarn forward, taking the stitch off, and putting it on exactly as you took it off, with the pipe coming in the back of the stitch. And now you're going to back stitch or purl 3 more. Again, you're reversing the side, your left pipe. And there's 1 row completed. Of course, I forgot to click my clicker, but so now we're going to begin row 2. So notice my even numbers are on this right-hand side. So the important thing is you don't want to get bogged down with your number system, although this tripped me up a few times. So you should write it down on a piece of paper so you remember that your even numbers are on your right-hand side. So you started over here. So row 2 says knit 3, then slip 1 purlwise with yarn in front. Alright, so you're going to do exactly what it said. You're going to knit 3, 1. Now notice, by the way, how my wrist of my right hand, and I'm going to do this row one way and then I'll show you another way. Notice how my hand is cocked. And I'm telling you, if you do a lot of knitting at one sitting, you're going to have a sore wrist. And I'm going to show you another way to do it after this row. This is how we typically make our stitches on the rods, but you know, these are lifted now forward, so it's a little trickier. Now, to do our slip stitch, they want us to bring it back, take the stitch off with the yarn here. If we have the yarn the other direction, it's going to hide our slip stitch. Knit 3 more. Bring your yarn back, slip 1 stitch, bring it forward, and knit 3 more. Next row, row 3, says as row 1. So instead of knitting 3, remember we're going to do those as purl stitches or back stitches. So there's 1, here's 2, here's 3. We're going to take this stitch off, slip it. These first few rows are critical. It's harder to see the slip stitch. Once you have several rows on here, you'll easily identify which stitch gets slipped. And you don't have to count. But the first couple rows you're going to need to count and keep careful track. Alright, so now we are ready to do row 4. On row 4, knit 3, purl 1. So that 1 stitch that we've been slipping is now going to be purled. So first we knit 3, oh, I was going to show you the other way. So here, when you take this next stitch off, we're still knitting it, but notice if I take it off, and instead of using my finger to go in under here, I can do one of two things. I can hold the yarn so it's more sideways. So my wrist is a little straighter. My finger and the yarn are going to go into the side of the stitch. So take it off, turn it just enough so that I can put the yarn in this way. But you notice I still have a little bit of a cock there. Now pull your yarn back to the front because you're going to purl this stitch that you've been slipping. And when you take it off, notice that there's these gaps here where it's not attached because this is the one you've been slipping. But this purling in the back of this now, back stitching this, is going to attach it. And you want to make sure when you make this stitch that you don't pull the yarn too tightly. Now you can already see this V starting to develop. And you want to bring that down just enough that you have a nice shape to that. And when you make the next stitch, which is again your knit stitch, is you take that stitch off and bring it off and make the stitch. You want to make sure you don't pull this one too tightly. So when you bring the yarn through, make sure that what you're pulling is the working yarn through this way, not pulling from this and tightening up on here. If it's not, now you can snug it up. Knit 2 more. If you make that too tight, it will make your top of your afghan look buckled because the slip stitches are too tight. So the key to making a correct slip stitch, when you take the stitch off, and again, you're coming in the back because you're going to purl this one, you don't want to make these too tight, either when you put them on the rod or when you begin again to make your next stitch. You want to make sure that you have enough slack between those stitches so that the afghan or garment, whatever you're doing, lays flat and isn't buckled. Now this completes row 4. And you'll see, now I can start to see my slip stitches already, just after one little cycle. So now we go reset our counter back to 1. Okay, now this is just as before. So you're going to back stitch these rather than knit them, because we're reversing our left pipe. There's the second one. Here's our third one. Now, this one just gets slipped. Take it off, put it on. 1, 2, 3. Take it off, put it on. Again, keep your yarn forward during that. And we do 3 more. Alright, second row, we're going to knit these and slip 1. So 1, 2, here's the third, and take your yarn back between your needles, bring your yarn to the front, is what that pattern calls for. Otherwise, if I had my yarn here and I took this off and slipped it, you're going to ruin your slip stitch design. You want to get the yarn up and out of the way. It's another way of thinking of it. You want to see that chain of stitches, and I need to have the yarn back here to do it. And when I begin the next row, or the next set of 3 stitches, don't pull this too tightly. Otherwise you'll have unattractive buckling and puckering in your... You want to keep those stitches well shaped. So it's good that the right side is facing you, because you can kind of monitor that, and it also makes following the pattern really simple. So back your yarn comes for the slip stitch. Just put it on in the next. Make sure you have enough yarn through there. You're not pulling that too tight when you make it. Okay, and back to row 3, and that was just as row 1. So again, we're going to back stitch or purl those. 1, 2, 3. Take the stitch off, put the stitch over. You see how much simpler it is on subsequent rows. You don't really have to keep track of where you are on your stitches. You'll just have to keep track of your rows. Again, slip right over to there. Don't turn it or twist it. And we're going to do another row 4. Let me finish here. Now, let me do this another way, because, like I say, if you have any problems with your wrist, you're going to get a little sore with the way the angle of your wrist is. So I suggest this. Take the yarn off and hold it down as if you were to put the yarn through this way, but use your thumb to push the yarn up. Pipe it. Take the yarn off. You're still going in the same side of the stitch. You could hold it up if you want to, but it's easier just to hold it down and use your thumb to push the yarn through. If you want to, you can hold it up in the air a little bit. Now, if you do it this way and you're using just one strand, it's no problem. If you're using multiple strands, I think it's a little trickier, but for this pattern, it doesn't matter. Now, this is the row again. This is row 4. We have to purl our slip stitch, the one we've been slipping all along. So you want to bring it down, put the yarn in through the back, make your stitch, and again, you don't want to pull that too snugly. And same thing when you resume the next stitch. You want to make sure you don't pull that too tight. And if you find that you do, if it got a little snug, because it's going to want to take some of the yarn as you're making that stitch from the other one, you can take your finger and make that stitch a little bit bigger again, just to elongate that stitch. You want them to be fairly even. And again, I'm going back to that system, but if you want to make this easier on your wrist, or if you can't bend your wrist at all, you're going to want to make your stitches with your thumb and push it up. Just make sure you have all your strands if you're doing any multiple strand. And we purl this, put it on, make sure you have enough yarn there, it's adequate, so that it doesn't buckle. And that is how, and already you can start to see the slip stitches on the surface. You don't want them real baggy, but if you don't have them baggy enough, it's going to look funny because this is going to get, remember that garter stitch stretches a lot. So that's how it's going to look. Now, once you have a lot of yarn, of course, like I say, for the throw itself, you're going to have 115 stitches. Be careful when you are moving your stitches around. When you have a lot of stitches, you're going to have to keep working them around. Because that slip stitch is looser, sometimes you're going to find when you go to do some of your stitches that your slip stitch will have crossed over. And you'll know as soon as you take it off there's something odd there. So make sure that those haven't crossed over, because as you make those tighter, if you try to push them too close together, the slip stitch, because it's looser, will cross over. So just make sure when you take them off and work them, if they seem crossed over, they probably are. But it should look like this as you go along. This is 70 rows so far. So it's going to knit it till you're out of yarn, basically. Let me show you one more quick thing, and that is, you'll remember when I showed you the hoops, the knitting hoops, that Lowe's was out of some of the pipe that day. So I went to another Lowe's once the weather got a little nicer, and so you remember that I used, for my US 50 size, I cut off my knitting needles and I stuck them on that 3/8 inch polyethylene that I'm making the throw on. So instead of doing that, you could buy this. This is sold as 1 inch OD reinforced tubing. And this is the same as your 3/4 inch rod or a US 50 needle. And to match a US 70 extreme knitting needle or your 1 inch pipe that I sell in my kits, this is clear tubing. It might be a little smashed. It doesn't matter. It's the circumference that matters. And this is 1 1/4 inch OD. That's how it's sold, that tubing. Then the size that will match the 1 1/4 inch pipe, which there's no equivalent in knitting needles. And again, this is pretty smashed, but it doesn't matter. It's the circumference. The trouble you're going to have as you get into these bigger tubes is not holding them together, but keeping them apart as you start to put the needles on there. So I actually have two kinds of wire in here. I have the 9 inch or the 9 gauge wire, but I also had some wire here at the house, and I don't know where it came from. It's almost like, I think it was a cat toy that you can't bend. It springs back. It's called something, and I want to say it's tempered wire, but the point being, here you're saying, well, those are too far apart, but once you're holding it, of course you're really not going to hold this between your knees. Once you put it in your basket, it's going to be just right. So you might have to get some wire that has spring to it to hold this apart. And then the biggest I could find, I mean, there's stuff online, there's tons of stuff, but I mean, they want you to buy either a ton of it or it's really expensive because it's meant for waterline. So the cheapest thing you're going to find, and this is equivalent to the 1 1/2 inch PVC pipe, the Schedule 40 pipe, So the actual diameter is 1 7/8, but this is spa tubing, it's called. It's 1.5 inch. That's what it's sold as, but that's the inside diameter. And it has ridges to it, but that will not be, it does not snag up your knitting. I thought that it might, but it doesn't. You will have to heat this, though, in real hot water. You can use a heat gun, but it was easier to use the hot water. And I molded it best I could. I couldn't get it quite completely. This was the last piece on the display they had. But, and you can see it almost wanted to bend here, but that's why you're going to put it in some hot water, real hot water. And inside I have wire, and I actually have the wire in a tube, in another plastic tube, the smaller diameter one. And that held it pretty well. Now, but this stuff stinks, by the way, this clear or the white. So you're going to want to keep it like in your back of your basement or something. The small ones, they don't have too much odor, but these do. Kind of smell like one of those old Barbie fun houses. So anyway, that's it for today. I hope you enjoy your slip stitch blanket. Thanks for watching.